Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now within.
Told you that I wasn't playing. Now you hear what I've been saying. Dedication. Dedication.
Habari Gani, this is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, April 1st, 2023. Our central theme today covers the life and great work of Jack O'Dell. As we here at KPFK Radio and our sister stations in Berkeley, New York, Washington, D.C., and Houston, along with our affiliate stations, are all part of the Pacifica Radio Network. And in 1977, Jack O'Dell became the chair of the Pacifica Foundation. He was a trailblazer, and we learn more about his life and work this hour as the marathon continues. We commence with our sister, Luyanda Kuboka, and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Nikhil Singh, professor of social and cultural analysis and history at New York University, and founding faculty director of the NYU Prison Education Program, here to discuss his book, Climbing Jacob's Ladder, The Black Freedom Movement Writings of Jack O'Dell. Then, later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Ian Rocksborough-Smith, assistant professor of history at the University of Fraser Valley in Toronto, Canada, here to discuss Jack O'Dell and Freedom Ways magazine. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Nipsey Hussle, Eddie Harris, Bobby Timmons, Curtis Fuller, Oscar Pettiford, Freddie Hubbard, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
There's the slave trader. Let's talk to him now. Go on, call to him.
Hey, Mr. Schultz, mind if we freshen up a little too?
Hello, boys. I'm glad to see you. It's you, because if you know how to treat them, they're not a really animal like people say. What they need is a good master. Like me, for example. You see, my profession has also its noble side. Some people call us peddlers of human flesh, zealous of souls. No. When you have a good conscience like mine, this work becomes a mission. Don't think for one moment as this is a lucrative profession. What do you think, for example, I make on this mail? $40 to $50 if it doesn't get first a hernia, yeah? And with the females it's the same. Oh, this wench. I think I'll do better with this one. I paid $250 for her. But I should get $650 for her if Zambak fattens her up. And perhaps $120 a dozen. They'll bring $250 on the market. So you'll say a profit of 80 to 120%. That's not bad. One moment. It's 420 miles from here to the market. And who pays for the ones who escape and the others who die on the way? If 1 out of 3 gets there, I'm lucky. Then feeding, clothing, castrating, the lousing, whipping, then the taxes, the tolls, the highway robbers, the fever, then my health, my family.
Molweni Ekai, this is Sister Luyanda Koboka with the historical drumbeat calendar for the week of April 6, 2005. April 6, 1959. Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, South Africa was founded by Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe and others. April 7, 1743. Toussaint Louverture was born in Haiti. April 8, 1870. Lenin, the father of Russian Revolution and the first socialist country in the world, was born. April 8, 1787. Africans leave England to return home to Africa and to establish settlement in Sierra Leone. April 8, 1928. Mary Tape, early emancipated Chinese woman living in the U.S. who worked against segregated schools for Chinese children in the 19th century San Francisco, is born. Menachem Begin begins one of the many massacres of Palestinians in village Deir Yassin to depopulate Palestine of Palestinians, thereby providing a settler colony for European Zionists. April 9th, 1966. Zimbabwe's African National Union begins armed struggle to decolonize Rhodesia from European settler control. April 10th, 1947. First meeting of Pan-African Trade Union of Dakar, Senegal. April 11th, 1977. France sends over 1,500 troops to Zaire to stop a rebellion in Shaba province. April 11th, 1981. Massive uprising in Brixton, London begins in demonstrations against police harassment and racism. This has been the historical drumbeat calendar for Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and streaming live at kpfk.org. For any questions or comments, you can contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And in the language of our freedom fighters in South Africa, we want to end with Amandla Awethu. Amandla Awethu. Amandla Awethu.
It's only when they begin their history in their state of freedom that they can come to properly understand their role. Thus, all Africans in America who begin their history in 1619 can never solve the problems they face. Those truly seeking to solve their people's problems must begin their history in Africa.
We want to be free from misery. We want to live like human beings. We don't want to live and dumb amongst dead dog and fly. And if you fight junker from sky to get food for now, we want to live like any other man. You believe we come here willingly. You believe we want we pick them to grow up in a place worse than hog pen. We want to be free.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Nikhil Pal Singh, Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, also Professor of History, and Faculty Director of the Prison Education Program at NYU, author and co-editor of the book alongside Jack Odell entitled Climbing Jacob's Ladder, the Black Freedom Movement Writing of Jack Odell. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Singh.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk to you.
Well, thank you for joining us. Now, Pacifica listeners may recall that Jack Odell was chair of the board of the Pacifica Foundation, which has oversight over this radio station, KPFK Los Angeles. But what else should we know about him and this book that you helped to produce?
Well, it's a long tale because Jack Odell's life really spanned the arc of what many historians have called the long civil rights movement. He became involved with civil rights in the 1930s and 40s. He joined the National Maritime Union. He joined the Communist Party. He joined the civil rights movement and worked closely with Dr. King. And then he went on to work with Jesse Jackson all the way through Jackson's second presidential campaign in 1988. So the arc of Jack's life and career really spans from the 1940s to the late 1980s, and he was active in a range of movements, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the peace movement, across that time, and was a consistent, principled voice on the left and on behalf of Black freedom struggles.
So what might he have learned in the National Maritime Union, a union of seafarers and sailors, and what might he have learned in the Communist Party that became useful in the civil rights movement?
Well, Jack grew up in the Black working class of Detroit, aspirationally, upwardly mobile. His parents wanted to send him off to, his grandparents who helped raise him wanted to send him off to become a pharmacist. He went down to Xavier in New Orleans to study. But the war was starting, and he wanted to be involved, as he put it, in the fight against fascism. And he joined the National Maritime Union because it wasn't segregated. It wasn't a segregated branch of the service. And on those ships, he describes getting his first political education in a kind of global vision of working class solidarity. This was before he joined the Communist Party, though he would have been meeting and talking with men mostly who were communists at that time. And I think the vision that Jack kind of developed in that moment was one that never left him, which was that the struggle for equality ran through both racial domination and the forms of exploitation and class inequality that had been generated by American capitalism, and that those struggles were not only struggles to be fought at home inside the United States, but that they were struggles that had an international purchase. And so in that sense, I think he was part of that zeitgeist, right? That moment that you have written about so beautifully and brilliantly in ways that have informed many of us over the years. And Jack went from that moment in the National Maritime Union where he was learning the history of worker struggles, learning the history of Black freedom struggles, to the Communist Party, because, as he said, the Communist Party was the one political formation that was fully on the side of Black people in that moment. I think what he learned in the Communist Party was kind of a continued deepening of his political analysis, but also how to organize and talk to ordinary people. And when that struggle within the Communist Party kind of ran its course, he just moved naturally into the civil rights movement. It wasn't a difficult passage for him, because for Jack, it wasn't really about a kind of ideological purity as much as it was about the kind of ends that he was seeking. And he was always looking for the right instruments and pragmatic approaches that could advance the struggle towards those ends, which were ultimately the ends of racial inequality, ending racial inequality and overcoming the kind of injustices attendant upon the organization of capitalist society.
Now, there's a famous story about President Kennedy in the early 1960s taking Dr. King into the Rose Garden to escape the prying eyes and perhaps wiretaps and other surveillance devices of the FBI to advise Dr. King to get rid of Jack. Talk to us about that story.
Well, the FBI had been after Jack O'Dell throughout the 1950s because he was a communist. He actually had gone in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1958, where he chastised James Eastland as a would-be dictator on behalf of white supremacy. The tide was already turning in 1958. You could be a communist and you couldn't be sent to jail anymore. But Jack had been underground throughout most of the 1950s. And then he became involved with King and the SCLC because he was a seasoned organizer. He was a skilled orator and fundraiser and behind-the-scenes worker. And no job was ever too small for Jack. You know, he didn't necessarily want to be in the limelight, but he worked very closely and effectively in every organization he was involved in. And Hoover, in his zeal to discredit Dr. King, knew everything that was going on inside SCLC, knew about Jack O'Dell and Jack's past, knew about Stanley Levison and his connections to the communists. But Jack was the one that they singled out, and they said, you know, you better get rid of this person or we're going to smear you with this. And of course, it was really Hoover and the FBI that held this over both the Kennedy administration and King and the SCLC. And both the Kennedy brothers pulled King aside in that Rose Garden walk and said, you know, this is something that you're going to have to do if you want to maintain our support for civil rights. You have to distance yourself from this person who has these ties to the far left and the Communist Party and who has this history. So, you know, King, in his own way, was very modest about this. He never repudiated Jack, but they came to an understanding that Jack needed to leave SCLC and move on to other activities. Their history and their ties did not end there, because in 1967, when King came out against the war, the person he gave his Beyond Vietnam speech to be published in Freedom Ways was none other than Jack O'Dell. So Jack's influence remained strong, and Jack, of course, was never someone to denounce people he worked with, and he remained faithful to Dr. King, really, in many ways, throughout those years in which he did other things. He worked at Freedom Ways, and he became involved in the peace movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and all of those things in the end were things that King himself came around to by the end of his life.
So Jack O'Dell also served as an advisor to Reverend Jesse Jackson when he ran for president in the 1980s. What do you think he brought to the table with regard to the Jackson campaigns?
Well, Jack went back to become interim director of SCLC after King's assassination. And then when Jesse Jackson left to form PUSH, People United to Serve Humanity, Jack decided to leave with Jesse because that was kind of a hallmark of Jack. He was always looking for the next opportunity, the next place where there was going to be some forward momentum. And he believed that Jesse had ideas, he had charisma, he had a sense of what might be done next. And he was with Jesse then on and off for quite a long period of time. And the first job that Jack had with Jesse Jackson was as advisor on international affairs. So Jack was very instrumental in the turn of Jesse Jackson towards an interest in the anti-apartheid struggle in Southern Africa and the struggle of Palestinian people in the Middle East against the kind of second-class citizenship and apartheid that they faced under the domination of the Israeli state. So Jack was very instrumental in essentially advising and educating Jackson on international affairs. That would have been the first thing that would have been extremely important there. And Jack, of course, had also been involved during those years in the anti-nuclear movement, and of course before that in the anti-Vietnam War movement. So he had a long history of involvement in international peace activism that definitely put its stamp on Jackson's outlook and helped Jackson, I think, to have a wider understanding of the world.
Now, you mentioned in passing that Jack was also associated with the Freedom Ways magazine, one of the premier journals of the Black left from the 1960s through the 1980s. And you mentioned that he helped to deliver Dr. King's anti-Vietnam War speech to Freedom Ways to be published. What else did Jack bring to the table with regard to that publication?
Well, Freedom Ways was edited by the very famous Esther Cooper Jackson, who had been the wife of James Jackson, both Communist Party members, both mentors to Jack in the Southern Negro Youth Congress going back to the 1940s and 1950s. And when Jack left SCLC, he joined Freedom Ways as an editor and did a lot of work editing pieces within Freedom Ways and writing unsigned editorials, collating and curating special issues on Mississippi, on all kinds of things. And of course, Freedom Ways well, but it's a treasure trove of Black intellectual thought and activism and intersections between Black freedom struggles and the left. And Jack was at the heart of all of that. And he worked at Freedom Ways for about a decade, and also wrote a number of really important pieces during that period. So one might even say that his exile from SCLC allowed a space for Jack to actually begin to think and write in ways that then left behind a very important record and body of work. And that body of work is part of what we assembled in the book Climbin Jacob's Ladder, a number of pieces that Jack wrote in Freedom Ways in the period from, say, around 1962, 1963 to the end of the decade. And of course, that's not the only thing that's in the book, but he wrote some very, very important pieces then.
Now, Jack O'Dell passed away a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken, at the age of 96, and he spent his final years in Vancouver, British Columbia, north of the border. Was that a political statement when he went into self-imposed exile?
It's a good question. I got to know Jack when I lived in Seattle and he lived in Vancouver, and I met him first at his 80th birthday. So that can give you a sense of the kind of timing of when I got to know Jack. I guess it was probably around 1994. I'm sorry, that's probably not right. My math is all off. It was around 2004. And we got to know each other and started working together on the book. Initially, we just started talking, getting to know one another. And I knew Jack wanted to leave behind some legacy, and so we started working together on what became Climbin Jacob's Ladder. And what he told me then was, in some ways, he left because he felt that his work with the movement had run its course. I would say there were political implications. I think, although Jack said this very mildly, he was ultimately disappointed where the Rainbow Coalition ended up. He saw the neoliberal turn in the Democratic Party. He saw Jesse Jackson in many ways accept a seat at the table in exchange for handing over the Rainbow's mailing lists. He didn't feel like there was really a place for him after 1988 in any formations that made sense for him. He was also an old man at that point, although he would live to be much, much older, amazingly, and was lucid really until his last days. And he went to Canada and was able to get Canadian citizenship. And I think Canada offered him not only a kind of new adventure, but offered him a kind of stability and support, especially healthcare. It was partly his wife, Jane Power, that led them to the Northwest, because she had grown up in the Northwest herself in the United States. But Canadian healthcare saved Jack's life on more than one occasion, I can tell you that. And I know we don't have time for all of that. But the life in Canada ended up being a pretty benign one and a gentle one for him. And it allowed him to live out his last 2 decades, talking to people like me and others who went to see him and learn this history from him. And so I wouldn't say it was an entirely political decision. It had some very important personal elements, but as we know, the personal is political, and in this case, it is also true. But Jack, I wouldn't say was in exile ever, really. He continued to travel across the border, to advise, to work with different community organizations, to meet with scholars, to give lectures. So it was a good period of his life, and a justly deserved one.
Professor Singh, you're also faculty director of the Prison Education Program at New York University, where you teach. What is that program?
So this would be another interview maybe we could do, and I can tell you in more detail about it. But about 10 years ago, we started offering college courses in an upstate prison in New York State at Wallkill Correctional Facility. We have about 50 students enrolled there. Those students work towards an Associate of Arts degree in liberal studies that is granted by NYU. And when they get out of prison, and most of our students will get out of prison because it's a medium security prison, and their sentences run from 3 to 7 years usually. When they get out of prison, we make a commitment to working with every single student that we can if they want to continue their education at NYU upon release. So we've now had about 30 students come out and continue towards their BA at NYU in New York City. As you may know, most of the men and women in prison in New York State come from the city and parole to the city. So we've been able to create what we call a bridge program, where we not only do college in prison, but we do a bridge from prison to college and work with individuals and their families and communities towards continuing their education and towards using some of the resources that NYU can offer to create forms of public and civic engagement around communities impacted by mass incarceration in our state. So it's been an incredible work of a large group of people, and we're grateful to the donors and sponsors and supporters like the Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation, but also New York University for being able to sustain this for 10 years, and we hope that we can sustain it for at least another 10 years, if not longer. So it's an effort, I think, to think about what universities can do to engage and give back, and to actually operate in the public interest, as I think they were designed to do initially, but often don't anymore.
Finally, Professor Singh, co-author and co-editor of Climbing Jacob's Ladder, the Black Freedom Movement writing of Jack O'Dell, talk to us about your next book, Reconstructing Democracy.
So my next book is kind of looking back at a lot of work I've done over the years with Jack, and also in my first book, Black as a Country, to really try to bring together a lot of work and a lot of thinking about the traditions of Black intellectuals and Black radicalism in the 20th century, especially the second part of the 20th century, and to think about what that tradition and that body of thinking and that body of practice offers to us in this moment, where we feel our democracy to be in peril, on life support even, and to think about what it would mean to revive and to bring back a kind of more robust and active sense of what it means to be a free, self-governing people in this world, and what the legacy of those who were brought here against their will and who struggled for equal citizenship over centuries can illuminate in terms of the way forward.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Singh, author and co-editor of Climbing Jacob's Ladder, the Black Freedom Movement writing of Jack O'Dell. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure and honor to talk to you, Dr. Horne.
Ditto.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is her sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
And now we go to Prison Radio Commentaries with Mumia Abu Jamal.
The idiocies of original intent. For several decades, right-wing ideologues and lawyers have argued that the U.S. Constitution must only be interpreted according to what they call original intent, or according to how the Founding Fathers would have intended. But assuming this were so, how do we know what they intended? In short, we don't. But in some cases, we do. Thomas Jefferson only wrote one book during his lifetime entitled Notes on the State of Virginia. But Mr. Jefferson was a writer of letters, and there gave freely of his opinions. In his letter of 24th June, 1813, to John W.S., Jefferson wrote, "The earth belongs to the living, not to the dead." Thomas Paine was a talented writer whose pamphlets and books steered a nation into a war against a king. His book, The Rights of Man, published 1791, argued that no generation is bound by the words of the past. Paine wrote, "Every age and generation must be as free to act in itself in all cases as the ages and generations which preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. Man has no property in man. Neither has any generation of property in the generations which are to follow. Thomas Paine, American revolutionary. As for Jefferson, guess who actually wrote most of the U.S. Constitution? None other than Thomas Jefferson himself. The idea of original intent didn't come from the Founding Fathers. It came from people in our lifetimes, in a political project designed to turn the clock back and strip people of their rights. It is an idea based on idiocy. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Ian Rocksborough-Smith, Professor of History at the University of Fraser Valley and what is referred to as British Columbia, Canada, author of the book Black Public History in Chicago, Civil Rights Activism from World War II into the Cold War. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Ian Rocksborough-Smith.
Thanks, Professor Horne. Really appreciate you having me on the program.
And we appreciate your joining us. So why did you write this book on Black public history in Chicago?
Well, in a nutshell, it evolved out of dissertation work I did at the University of Toronto under my supervisor there, Professor Rick Halpern, who himself is a historian of Chicago. And I had written a master's thesis on Freedom Ways magazine for Simon Fraser University under Professor Karen Ferguson from that institution. And Freedom Ways magazine had its initial arts editor was a woman named Margaret Burroughs, who became instrumental in creating and forming what becomes known as the DuSable Museum of African American History, which is still alive and well to this day in Chicago. And so, in a nutshell, I ended up writing that book because I was following the sort of currents and trajectories of folks who'd been sort of somewhat associated with Freedom Ways magazine and what they were doing in Chicago over a lot of the same period into the 1960s and early 1970s.
So you mentioned Margaret Burroughs, who is still a kind of legendary figure in Black Chicago. Talk to us about her experiences overseas in Mexico City, in Moscow, in Leipzig, and formerly socialist East Germany.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said still, for any scholars or interested writers and activists out there who want to learn more about her incredible life. Overseas, I think, very much influenced by her travels abroad, outside of the United States, to think critically about the U.S. as an empire. And I think it really, she gained a lot from her time, particularly in Mexico City, in the early years of the Cold War, when she was initially a public school teacher in Chicago, and she went to go and study art in Mexico City, as part of a sojourn away to kind of also escape some of the worst forms of McCarthyism in America. And I think brought back a lot of the kind of revolutionary artistic traditions that were still very active in Mexico at that time. Worked with figures like Elizabeth Catlett, the Taller de Grafica Art Institute, and then other world travels, particularly in the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, East Germany, and also in Africa. She traveled extensively after she'd founded the museum, and bringing a lot of that sort of cosmopolitan internationalism that was foundational, I think, to her very radical left-wing perspective that she brought into kind of the founding of the museum and a lot of her work, her artwork, and her influence in Chicago.
Where did she travel in Africa?
East Africa was what I'd heard about the most in some of the research I've done, but that was in the 1970s, early 1970s, I believe. And there's still probably some great articles or research for scholars to be done in archives at the DuSable Museum of African American History that probably chronicle some more of those travels. The time I was doing the research for what becomes the book, access to that particular archive was unavailable, so I had to use archives and talk to folks in and around Chicago who knew about these things, and that was what was available to me at the time. So.
Now, who was Charles Burroughs? What was his relationship to Margaret Burroughs? And I understand he had an interesting history with the Soviet Union as well. Yeah, absolutely. I think probably even more so than Margaret Burroughs, but he was married to her. He was her second husband, and they together as a couple were part of what the group of folks who really kind of put together the group that eventually founds the museum in Chicago. And he becomes, I think he had these sort of familial connections dating back generations to the Soviet Union, and I think in ways that were even more connected than Margaret herself was. Margaret was from a family that had migrated to Chicago from Louisiana originally. She'd grown up Catholic, whereas Charles Burroughs, his part of his childhood and his youth were very much in the context of being connected to the Soviet project and what was happening, in the Eastern Bloc because of his parents' connections. Wilhelmina Burroughs, I believe, was a close family member. Now, if I'm not mistaken, didn't the Burroughs family have some relationship to entertainment in the former Soviet Union, or carnivals or circuses or something like that?
Yes, that's correct. I'm trying to remember there's a little biography that was written of Charles Burroughs that connects to that, where they were involved in some kind of sort of professional entertainment circuit in the Soviet Union. That itself would be a really fascinating study for someone as to kind of further unpack that biography of that family. And I think his parents, I think, had a big influence on what the family was doing through that period. I think they were originally from Harlem, and they'd gone over to the Soviet Union, I think in the 20s and the 30s, and so that's when a lot of that took place, if I'm recalling correctly.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that Margaret Burroughs had a relationship to Freedom Ways magazine, of which you have written about, as you have suggested. Freedom Ways magazine was in existence from the early 1960s to the mid-1980s. And full disclosure, back in the day, I used to write regularly for Freedom Ways magazine. But talk to our audience about Freedom Ways magazine. What was its purpose? Who helped to start it, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's to this day one of the still very underrated periodicals of the civil rights and Black Power eras and of the African American freedom struggle. And I say this, humbly, as a Anglo-descended Canadian from the Pacific Northwest. But I think that it is important to think about how this journal, situated itself kind of at the intersections of the freedom movement in the United States as it was evolving into the 1960s and the anti-colonial movements that were spreading worldwide, particularly in Africa and Asia and Latin America. And it created kind of an intersection for activists from all around the world. We were talking about Derek Walcott before, Pablo Neruda, major figures, Chetty Jagan from Guyana, all had pieces appear in the magazine, and very influential ideas and thinkers, influenced by, an elder generation of activists like W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, whose ideas figure prominently in the journal, So I really think that the journal also presented kind of like a bridge between generations as well. People who had been active in the 1930s and 40s on anti-colonialism, as well as fighting against racism in the United States, and continuing, in a sense, that same kind of outlook into the 1960s with the formation of this journal, even though it was, arguably part of this sort of little journal movement that was active in a setting like New York, which was relatively safer to be able to produce that kind of material at the sort of height of the Cold War, let's say. It was still an incredibly significant journal because of its reach, because of the people that were writing for it. And it was also, largely connected to the Southern movement as it was reemerging in the early 1960s there, largely due to the efforts of one of its editors, Jack Odell, who is also someone who's lesser known in the annals of histories of the civil rights movement, largely because of the associations of his radical political past to the Communist Party.
And Jack Odell is not unknown to the Pacifica audience. He used to serve as the head of the board of the Pacifica Foundation, which has oversight over this radio station, KPFK, and of course, self-exiled in your neck of the woods, in Vancouver, in the Pacific Northwest. Now, Freedom Waves magazine was a project of the Black left, but as you suggested, had a broad reach. You mentioned the award-winning Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, the award-winning Caribbean writer Derek Walcott, but also James Baldwin, Alice Walker, Lorraine Hansberry, Shirley Graham Du Bois, all had ties of one sort or another with Freedom Waves magazine. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a magazine that had sort of inroads to all these literary and cultural luminaries, really, of that era. It had connections to, writers, artists, activists, public thinkers who, made massive impacts on the American scene when it came to, producing art and literature and political ideas that extended the whole notion of, the push for social justice and equality in that time well beyond the kind of confines of, the Cold War narratives for civil rights, which, tended to produce this idea that, America was this democratic nation that just had to simply live up to its ideals, rather than kind of fundamentally questioning the structures of, U.S. empire, which had largely, created the systems of racial inequality that persist to this day, right? In terms of the legacies of racial slavery and violent removals of indigenous peoples, not only in what is today considered to be the continental United States, but elsewhere in the world where European empires have expanded. And I think it was, really an important journal because it was making those kinds of connections very early on, at a moment when not a lot of other components necessarily of the American movement for civil rights, let's say, was being kind of allowed to express that in the public realm.
So I infer from what you're saying that because Freedom Waves magazine was breaking new ground, that it was ruffling feathers in Washington. Did it come under any particular scrutiny by the U.S. authorities?
Well, there's definitely FBI files that were of and about Freedom Waves magazine, and certainly of many of the editors involved, right? Jim Jackson, who was married to the late great Esther Cooper Jackson, who passed away just this last August, and was the managing editor of the journal. I'm guessing that you had a chance to know her quite well at different times. The FBI hounded these folks largely for their entire careers, as did other state security intelligence apparatuses. You can certainly see that in sort of recent accounts of Jack Odell's life. There's a great documentary out a very short one on his life called The Issue of Mr. Odell, that was done by another local scholar from this part of the world that I'm from, in the Northwest. Rami Katz is the filmmaker, where, you know, Mr. Odell is able to kind of retell some of the surveillance that he experienced, and it was just sort of a everyday life occurrence for him. That it was likely had his phone tapped, and it was likely there was someone outside wherever he was working or living at the time who was associated with the FBI, and it was just part of, you know, the everyday existence that he had to endure through different parts of the 1950s and even into the 1960s, during the time that he's writing for Freedomways. And, you know, there are FBI files on a lot of these folks that have been made available through Freedom of Information Acts and are possible for folks to look up. And I think it just kind of reminds us of the power of the security state to you know, impact you know, what was politically possible for people. It sometimes maybe harder to understand it in the present context when everything is so digitized, but surely there are similar kinds of surveillance going on today, just taking a different form.
You are correct. I knew Esther Cooper Jackson quite well and mourned her passing like so many others. I well recall visiting the Freedomways office in Lower Manhattan, 80 East 11th Street. I still recall it. Also 799 Broadway. And of course, I knew Jack Odell. And Jack Odell, as you suggested, there was a very notorious episode when President John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s took Martin Luther King Jr. into the Rose Garden of the White House because he thought his office might be bugged by the FBI, and told Dr. King that he needs to get rid of Jack Odell, who was a close advisor of Dr. King, immediately, if not sooner. Dr. King said that he would, but tried to keep a subterranean relationship with Jack, which then led to more troubles for both Jack and Dr. King. But Freedomways magazine also attracted a number of premier visual artists, including Romare Bearden and Jacob Lawrence. Talk to us about that aspect of their work.
Yeah, I mean, all of those artists had their work appear in the journal. Romare Bearden, I think in particular, was very influential in you know, penning political cartoons in the journal, and I think that visual element to the journal was also a key component of its lifespan, and I think that, you know, it's really fascinating to think about just sort of how comprehensive a journal it was. It was a journal of like politics, culture, and literature, and included visual elements as well. Of course, it parallels other journals in its time, like Liberator Magazine or Black World, and Negro Digest out of Chicago. But I think it was still very unique because of the reach that it had in terms of having contributors like the ones you mentioned, you know, consistently contributing to it and providing, you know, unique work that was produced for the journal explicitly.
Now, despite its stellar contributions, Freedomways magazine did not survive the 1980s. Why is that?
I think there was a number of factors, both internal and external to the journal. Changing forms of media and communications probably was definitely one of them. This is on the cusp of, you know, the sort of information age, and having a quarterly review type of publication just is something that, you know, was not a form of output that was, you know, tenable to kind of continue to publish without some big institutional affiliation. And secondly, I think there were political dynamics in that sort of late Cold War era, if you will, that also impacted the internal dynamics of the journal. One longtime editor, very important editor, John Henry Clark, who taught at Hunter College, I'm sure you're probably familiar with his work, had a falling out, as I understand it, with Esther Cooper Jackson and some of the other editors at the journal. And it was over the question of the role of the CIA in America at that time, which, as we know, was very much involved in lots of nefarious attempts to kind of subvert democracy elsewhere in the world, and has historically been the case. But in the 1980s, of course, this was happening in different parts of the world, especially Latin and South America. And I can't remember the exact incident because it was almost 20 years ago that I did the research around it. But John Henrik Clarke definitely had a falling out with the editors around the question of U.S. foreign policy at that time.
Well, I can shed a bit of light on this. One, there were problems with Freedom Ways magazine, or problems heaped upon Freedom Ways magazine when they did a special issue, or tried to do a special issue on the Palestinian question. Some of their readers and contributors took exception to that. And with regard to John Henrik Clarke, some of that controversy dealt with the Angola crisis of the mid-1970s, where the U.S. CIA intervened, and John Henrik Clarke was perceived as being on the side of Jonas Savimbi. I don't want to go too deep into the woods and into the grass about this, but for those looking for detail, just look at my book on Southern Africa entitled White Supremacy Confronted. In any case, Ian Rocksborough-Smith, author of the book Black Public History in Chicago, what's next for you? What do our readers have to look forward to?
Well, I'm trying to turn my attention now to thinking about similar eras to what the book Black Public History sort of chronicled in the mid-1950s, but I'm looking especially at sort of intersections of race and religion in urban America, and I'm interested in trying to understand how Catholic liberals of this period, particularly white liberals, were subverting in a lot of cases, or acting in ways that were very limited around the issue of civil rights and discrimination. And I think that there has been a lot of new literature recently on some of these groups, like the Catholic Interracial Council, for example. And I think that, coming from the background of having understood some of the histories of Black left in America, of the compromises that were made under McCarthyism, I think, having kind of a reassessment, you could say, of the sort of religious liberalism of this period as well is really important to kind of have some greater understanding of what was actually taking place, especially when these big kind of compromises around the Cold War were happening, in the wake of like the Taft-Hartley act, or the kind of impact that McCarthyism had on the labor movement. These are all, I think, really important to kind of come back to, especially as we look at sort of changes in neighborhoods in urban America through the 1950s, and the kind of the ways that a lot of like Catholic liberals dealt with that moment.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Ian Rocksborough-Smith, author of the book Black Public History in Chicago. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Dr. Horne.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Nikhil Singh, Dr. Ian Rocksborough-Smith. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. This program can be reheard for the next 60 days. Go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Please stay tuned for our sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.